Hello again, Connecting Point, and today we're going to complete our study through Micah. So we're in chapter 7, and I called this teaching today God Who is Faithful, and I think by the end you'll see how that title fits this chapter. But we're going to break this chapter down into 3 sections. The first section is verse 1 to 7, which talks about and continues talking about from previous texts about the immoral state of Israel. And in verses 8 to 13 is a warning to Israel's enemies. And in verse 14 to 20 is a concluding prayer which has different elements to it. And that's where we will end off our study, is with prayer and praise. But to get started, let's get right into the text of Micah chapter 7, starting in verse 1. What misery is mine! I am like one who gathers summer fruit at the gleaning of the vineyard. There is no cluster of grapes to eat, none of the early figs that I crave. The faithful have been swept from the land. Not one upright person remains. Everyone lies in wait to shed blood. They hunt each other with nets. Both hands are skilled in doing evil. The ruler demands gifts. The judge accepts bribes. The powerful dictate what they desire. They all conspire together. The best of them is like a briar, the most upright worse than a thorn hedge. The day God visits you has come, the day your watchmen sound the alarm. Now is the time of your confusion. Do not trust a neighbor. Put no confidence in a friend. Even with the woman who lies in your embrace, guard the words of your lips. For a son dishonors his father, a daughter rises up against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are the members of his own household. And then verse 7, but as for me, I watch and hope for the Lord. I wait for God my Savior. My God will hear me. So the first 6 verses describe the immoral state that the people of God have arrived at. And it's like a summary statement of all that's wrong with their society. And I've kind of simplified it into 6 things that are wrong with this society. In verse 1, it references the fruitless lives that are not adding up to anything. In verse 2, it talks about faithlessness, and this faithlessness is kind of the turning away from God and God's ways. Again in verse 2, it talks about the violence in their society, as everyone lies in wait to shed blood. And then in verse 3, it goes to the idea of corrupt leadership. Even the leaders, the ones that are trying to lead, have become corrupt at different levels of leadership. Whether they're rulers, judges, or whatever, they're conspiring and they're demanding bribes and gifts for their judgments. And this ends up in a day of confusion. So it's an interesting verse in verse 4, the day God visits you has come, and now is the time of your confusion. So here they are living in a certain way, and then when they're confronted with God, it's like, oh, and they can't make sense of anything. Everything's turned upside down. And then in verse 5, it talks about how everyone is suspicious of everyone else, their neighbors, and even those who are closest to them. You can't trust anyone, so there's no trust. There's only suspicion. And then in verse 6, it talks about how families have been broken. So it talks about the fruitlessness, the faithlessness, violence, leaders who are corrupt, confusion, not being able to make sense. Everyone suspicious of everyone else, and families are broken. But in verse 7, regardless of the condition of the society around him, Micah, even though he's apparently in the minority here, he knows where to place his hope and trust. And these two summary statements from verse 7, I watch and hope for the Lord. And this statement of faith, this exclamation, God will hear me. So you have this society that is all bent out of shape and twisted, and it's all going wrong because of their fruitlessness and their faithlessness. But Micah is steadfast. Micah is focused. He's watching in hope for what the Lord will do. And he has faith that when he calls out to the Lord, that God will hear him. So I want to go to a table talk. And the question is, how do you manage to remain and grow in faithfulness even when the influences around you may be negative and discouraging? So take a couple minutes, think about that, and then we'll come back and we'll begin with verse 8. Okay, this section in Micah 7, which covers verse 8 to 13, is a warning to the enemies of Israel. And let's start with verse 8. He says, Do not gloat over me, my enemy. Though I have fallen, I will rise. Though I sit in darkness, the Lord will be my light. Because I have sinned against him, I will bear the Lord's wrath until he pleads my case and upholds my cause. He will bring me out into the light. I will see his righteousness. Then my enemy will see it and will be covered with shame. She who said to me, Where is the Lord your God? My eyes will see her downfall. Even now she will be trampled underfoot like mire in the streets. The day for building your walls will come, the day for extending your boundaries. In that day people will come to you from Assyria and the cities of Egypt, even from Egypt to the Euphrates, and from sea to sea, and from mountain to mountain. The earth will become desolate because of its inhabitants as the result of their deeds. So verse 8 to 10, Micah is saying before the enemies of Israel get too excited about their downfall, Micah provides this warning. He says, before you gloat, just know Israel will rise. But he also reflects on the idea that Israel will suffer the consequences of their unfaithfulness. But in the end, God, who is their judge, is also their deliverer. And just to review verse 9, he says, because I have sinned against him, I will bear the Lord's wrath until he pleads my case and upholds my cause. He will bring me out into the light, and I will see righteousness. And that is a theme, this idea that God, who is their judge, is also their deliverer, that has run really throughout the whole book of Micah. And God's judgment will be turned onto Israel's enemies. We see that in verse 10. And then we have this interesting verse in verse 11, the day for building your walls will come. And this verse 11 alludes to the story of Judah returning to the land after being exiled for 70 years in Babylon. And so this is a story, an event that is happening in Micah's future, 140 or 150 years later. But Nehemiah 4 is a living example of this whole section starting in verse 8 of Micah 7. And I want to go to Nehemiah 4 and read you this story, and you'll see how this fits. So the context is Judah has been in exile. Were taken in exile by Babylon, but now there's been a change of power, and the Persians have come along and have replaced Babylon as the earth superpower. And under Persia, Israel is allowed, or Judah is allowed, to return to their land and to rebuild Jerusalem, and to rebuild their city, rebuild the temple, etc., and their homes, and then to begin to resettle back into their land. And so the beginning of the book of Nehemiah describes part of this process where Nehemiah appeals to the king, and then the king says, "Oh, sure, here," and they even helped them with some of the supplies they would need, etc. And they arranged for the exiles of Judah to begin to return to the land. But when, particularly in the book of Nehemiah, when they get back to the land, they find that there are still people around, and they're not necessarily friendlies. And this is described starting in verse 1 of chapter 4 of Nehemiah. So let's go there. When Sanballat heard that they were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. So Sanballat is a enemy of Israel. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, at Sanballat's side, said, "What are they building? What they are building, even a fox climbing up on it would break down the wall of stones." So Tobiah is making fun of their construction skills. And then in verse 4, "Hear us, our God, for we are despised." This is Nehemiah. Now, replying to this, "Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders." So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half of its height, for the people worked with all their heart. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. But, and this is a key verse, verse 9, "But we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat." Meanwhile, the people in Judah said, "The strength of the laborers is giving out, and there is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall." Also, our enemies said, "Before they know it or see us, we will be right there among them and will kill them and put an end to their work." Then the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times over, "Wherever you turn, they will attack us." So verse 13, "Therefore I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. After I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, 'Don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives, and your homes.' When our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to our own work. From that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other. And each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked, but the man who sounded the trumpet stayed with me. Then I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, 'The work is extensive and spread out, and we are widely separated from each other along the wall. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, join us there. Our God will fight for us.' So we continued the work with half the men holding spears, from the first light of dawn till the stars came out. At that time I also said to the people, Have every man and his helper stay inside Jerusalem at night, so they can serve us as guards by night and as workers by day. Neither I, nor my brothers, nor my men, nor the guards with me took off our clothes. Each had his weapons, even when we went for water. So there's a lot in that chapter about this process of them rebuilding the wall, as it was alluded to in verse 11 of Micah 7. And the whole process of is when, as they return, their enemies are gloating against them, just as it was pointed out in verse 8 of Micah 7. And so you have these gloaters, Sanballat and Tobiah, leading their groups, and they're all opposed to Israel getting reestablished in the land. And it's interesting how there are some parallels here to our own spiritual walk. You know, sometimes as we come to Christ, there's going to be those, including the enemy of our soul, who says, oh, come on, look what you're building. It doesn't add up to anything. You know, what you're doing is really dumb. You're never going to succeed, right? You know, this is who you were in the past. Who do you think you are now? And sometimes that is a real challenge for us in our spiritual walk. But as Nehemiah responded to those who were opposing him, is the way we need to respond in our own life. And in verse 4, you know, the first 4 words, hear us, our God. So when things are ramping up, Nehemiah turns to the Lord, right? And even later on, you know, as things are developing, you know, Nehemiah's first response is to turn to the Lord. Remember the Lord, he says in verse 14, who is great and awesome. He says, remember him, and then fight for your families and your sons and your daughters and your wives and your homes. And, you know, he talks about, you know, the men working and guarding. He talks about this life that they were have of rebuilding this wall. Well, there's some parallel there for us, as we need to walk in ways remembering the Lord in prayer. We need to be working, but we also need to have our weapons at the ready to protect our soul. And, you know, they talk about swords, we talk about the Word of God. We need to have the weapons of our warfare. Sometimes we need to go back and review Ephesians chapter 6 about truth, the belt of truth, and the faith, the shield of faith, etc. All those things that are weapons of our warfare. And we need to be aware of what those are so that we can protect ourselves from the enemy. And that's part of this whole idea of rebuilding the walls, or building our life. And so I want to go to a table talk, and I want you to think, and maybe you need to pull out Nehemiah chapter 4 and just go over it a little bit, but what are some possible lessons from Nehemiah 4 that can apply to your spiritual growth? And we'll be back in a minute with a conclusion. So we conclude the book of Micah with starting in verse 14 of chapter 7. And it's a concluding prayer. And there's different sections to this prayer. And so the first section is verse 14 itself. And I'll read that. It says, shepherd your people with your staff, the flock of your inheritance, which lives by itself in a forest, in fertile pasture lands. Let them feed in Bashan and Gilead, as in days long ago. So Micah begins this prayer recognizing God as the one who leads and cares for his people. God is the shepherd. God is the one who leads the flock. God is the one who knows where the pasture lands are and knows how to feed the people. And so Micah begins there, which is really a place of humility, because the people don't know. They don't, obviously, in their immoral state, they didn't know how to care for themselves. They didn't know how to make good decisions. And so they need to humble themselves and follow their shepherd. Then in verse 15, and 15 to 17, It says, "As in the days when you came out of Egypt, I will show them my wonders. Nations will see and be ashamed. Deprived of all their power, they will put their hands over their mouths, and their ears will become deaf. They will lick dust like a snake, like creatures that crawl on the ground. They will come trembling out of their dens, and they will turn in fear to the Lord our God and will be afraid of you." So this section of his prayer, 15 to 17, really is a prophetic utterance based on who God is. But the 4 points of prophecy here is prophecy concerning the enemies of Israel. This is what the consequences are going to be. Also, God will show his wonders. And then he also says the nations will be powerless. And that they will, number 4, they will eventually turn in fear to the Lord. So that's kind of the prophetic piece of this prayer. And then we get to verse 18, which is the praise of the Lord. It's a prayer of praise. And this is how we end the book of Micah. "Who is a God like you, who pardons sin and forgives the transgression of the remnant of his inheritance? You do not stay angry forever, but delight to show mercy. You will again have compassion on us. You will tread our sins underfoot and hurl all our iniquities into the depths of the sea. You will be faithful to Jacob and show love to Abraham as you pledged on oath to our ancestors in days long ago." And those are the closing words of Micah. So he prays at the end this prayer of praise to God, and he recognizes 4 really important characteristics of God that are key to the restoration of his people, and they're key to the restoration of our souls as we follow Jesus. And these 4 things, first of all, are God's forgiveness, his forgiveness for their sins, God's mercy on them, even though they have been unfaithful, God's compassion for them, his motivation. Why does he do this for us? Why did Christ come and die for us? Because he loves us. He has compassion for us. And then in the end, God's faithfulness, because he will do what he said he will do. So God's forgiveness, God's mercy, God's compassion, and God's faithfulness. So we're going to end with this table talk. And if you're with someone, if you're not, you can kind of think about this and meditate on this idea. But if you're with someone, share examples of God's forgiveness, mercy, compassion, and faithfulness from your own experience. And then pray a prayer of thanks. And that's the end of our study in the book of Micah.